The night was unusually quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A soft wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Arya walked along the narrow path leading to the old cemetery, her steps crunching against the gravel. She clutched an old letter in her hand, the edges worn and slightly torn, as if someone had folded and unfolded it too many times. The words scribbled inside had been haunting her for days. It wasn't just the content. It was the feeling, the weight of it, like a whisper calling her back to a place she hadn't seen in years. Her grandmother's handwriting was shaky but clear enough. "Go to the graveyard. You'll find what you've been looking for. Not all graves rest in peace." Arya had laughed bitterly when she first read it. What could an old grave possibly offer her now? Answers? Closure? The idea seemed absurd, but something about the letter wouldn't let her ignore it. Her grandmother had never spoken in riddles, never told tales of ghosts or curses. Yet here she was, standing at the entrance of a place she had promised herself she would never return to. The village had changed, though not by much. The houses still leaned against each other like tired old men, their wooden frames creaking with age. The streets were empty, and the silence felt heavier now. The cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gate rusted, but still strong enough to hold back what lay beyond. Arya hesitated for a moment, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She pushed the gate open, the creak echoing into the night, and stepped inside. Rows of gravestones stretched before her, their inscriptions faded with time. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for the one grave she had avoided thinking about for so long. It wasn't hard to find. It sat near the edge of the cemetery, half hidden by overgrown weeds. The headstone was cracked but still standing, bearing a name she knew too well. Elias Ward, her father's grave. Arya swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had always imagined this moment differently. She thought there would be anger or sadness, maybe even relief, but standing there now, all she felt was emptiness. The kind of hollow ache that comes from years of unanswered questions. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. That was when she saw it, a faint glow pulsing beneath the surface of the dirt. Her breath hitched, and she froze, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. The glow was subtle at first, like the faint shimmer of moonlight on water, but it grew brighter with each passing second. "What the?" she whispered, leaning closer. Her heart raced as the glow illuminated a small section of the ground. It wasn't natural. She could feel that deep in her bones. It wasn't just light, it was a signal, a calling, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt compelled to follow it. Arya's fingers hesitated above the glowing patch of dirt, her mind racing. This wasn't something she could easily explain or dismiss. She wanted to step back, to leave and pretend she hadn't seen it, but her body didn't listen. Slowly, she pressed her hand against the cold earth. The glow pulsed once as though it had acknowledged her touch, and then spread outward in soft waves of light. A shiver ran down her spine as she watched. It wasn't threatening, but it felt alive, as though the ground itself was breathing. Her pulse quickened. She reached for the small trowel she had brought with her. She didn't know why she had thought to pack it, but now it felt like some part of her had known this would happen. Carefully, she began to dig, pushing the damp soil aside. The glow brightened with every scoop, as though encouraging her to go deeper. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the soft scrape of metal against dirt. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her, but when she looked over her shoulder, the cemetery remained still. Shadows from the surrounding trees stretched across the graves, their shapes distorted under the faint moonlight. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, the edge of something metallic caught her eye. Her breath hitched. She brushed away the remaining dirt with her hands, revealing a small box. It was old, its surface tarnished and covered in strange markings that looked like they didn't belong to any language she recognized. The glow seemed to emanate from within the box, escaping through the tiny gaps in its seams. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out of the hole, the weight of it heavier than it should have been for its size. She sat back on her heels, staring at it, unsure of what to do next. The air around her felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. She felt it in her chest, a mix of anticipation and dread. Without thinking, she opened the box. The hinges creaked as the lid came free, revealing a bundle of papers inside, yellowed with age. The glow immediately faded, leaving her in the dim light of the cemetery. She let out a shaky breath, unsure if she felt relieved or disappointed. Carefully, she pulled out the papers, her eyes scanning the words. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and precise. At first, it didn't make sense, a series of disjointed sentences, fragments of thoughts. But then one line caught her attention, freezing her in place. "They will come for you if you find this. Trust no one." Her stomach dropped. The words felt personal, directed at her, though she knew that wasn't possible. She flipped through the rest of the papers, her heart pounding. Among the fragmented notes were sketches of symbols, some of which matched the ones etched into her father's gravestone, and a map of the cemetery with certain graves marked. One of those graves was hers. She stared at the map, her hands trembling. A wave of nausea swept over her as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It didn't make sense. How could her name be there? She was alive, wasn't she? Her pulse thundered in her ears as questions flooded her mind. What was this? Who had left it here, and why now? A soft rustling behind her snapped her out of her thoughts. She whipped her head around, clutching the papers to her chest. The cemetery was still, but the air felt heavier, thicker. It wasn't the wind. Something was there. She could feel it. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice steadier than she expected. There was no response, just the faint sound of her own breathing, and then a whisper. Barely audible, but it was there. "Leave it." Her heart stopped. It was a man's voice, low and hoarse, as if dragged from a place where sound didn't belong. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the box and papers tightly. She scanned the darkness, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, sending a chill down her spine. "Leave it." She didn't wait to find out who or what was speaking. With the box in one hand and the papers in the other, she turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cemetery blurred around her as she fled, but one thought burned in her mind. She had to know the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Arya didn't stop running until she reached the gate of the cemetery. She leaned against the cold iron bars, her chest heaving, the box clutched tightly in her arms. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, deep, disembodied, and commanding, still echoed in her ears. It wasn't just a trick of her imagination. She had heard it. Someone, or something, didn't want her to have what she had found. She glanced down at the box, its worn edges pressing into her arms. The glow was gone, but the weight of it felt heavier now, as though it carried more than just papers and secrets. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could think. The village wasn't far, but the idea of going back to her grandmother's old house with its darkened halls and creaking floors sent a shiver down her spine. Still, it was the only place she could go. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every sound, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, set her nerves on edge. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone following her, but the path behind her remained empty. The air felt colder now, heavy with an unease she couldn't shake. She tightened her grip on the box, her knuckles whitening, and quickened her pace. By the time she reached the house, her heart was still pounding. The old structure loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless. She pushed open the front door, the creak echoing through the empty rooms, and locked it behind her. For a moment she just stood there, catching her breath and listening to the silence. The house felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that didn't come from a lack of heat but from something deeper, something wrong. Arya set the box on the dining table and flipped on the overhead light. The faint buzz of the old bulb filled the room as a dull yellow glow bathed the space. She unfolded the papers, her hands still trembling slightly. The words stared back at her, fragmented and haunting. "Trust no one," she whispered, reading the warning again. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, the texture rough and brittle. The symbols on the second page caught her attention. They were drawn with precision, each one interlocking with the next in a pattern that seemed deliberate, purposeful. She remembered seeing some of these same markings on her father's gravestone, What did they mean? And why had her father's name been linked to this grave, these secrets? Her eyes fell to the map. The small, hand-drawn diagram of the cemetery showed graves she didn't recognize, each marked with a symbol. Her name stood out, written in shaky letters near the edge of the page, circled and underlined. Next to it, in smaller writing, was a date, the exact day her father had died. Her stomach tightened as a chill crept up her spine. How could this be possible? How could her name and that date have been written here, buried with these papers, all these years? She leaned back in her chair, trying to steady her thoughts. The pieces weren't fitting together, but they all pointed to something larger, something she wasn't ready to face. Her father's disappearance, the glowing grave, the warning in the letter. None of it was coincidence. Someone had known she would come back. Someone had been waiting for her to find this. The sound of glass breaking shattered the silence. Arya jumped, her heart racing, and spun toward the source. It came from the living room. She froze, listening. The house had been empty when she arrived. She was certain of it. The thought of someone else being here, someone who had followed her, sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound firm. There was no response, just the faint creak of floorboards, as if someone was moving slowly, deliberately. Her eyes darted to the box and the papers. Was this why the voice had told her to leave it? Was someone already trying to take it from her? She grabbed the box and shoved the papers back inside, her hands moving quickly but clumsily. Her breaths were short, shallow as she backed away from the table. The creaking grew louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever was in the house, was coming for her. Clutching the box to her chest, Arya bolted toward the back door. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers shaking as the creaking reached the doorway to the kitchen. She didn't dare look back. Finally, the lock clicked, and she threw the door open, running into the night without looking back. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She ran toward the only place she could think of, the historian's house. If anyone could help her understand what was happening, it was him. As she sprinted down the darkened street, the image of the glowing grave burned in her mind, along with the whispered warning. "They will come for you." And now, she believed it. Arya reached the historian's house, her chest heaving and her legs trembling from the sprint. The modest home stood at the edge of the village, partially hidden by a line of trees. A dim light flickered in the window, a reassuring sign that someone was awake. She banged on the door, her panic overriding any sense of decorum. "Mr. Hargrove, open the door, please, it's me, Arya," she shouted, glancing over her shoulder into the darkness. The air around her felt charged, as if something unseen was pressing closer. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and an elderly man appeared. His face was pale and tired, framed by silver hair and thick glasses that caught the faint glow of his desk lamp. He looked at her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern when he saw her disheveled state. "Arya? What's going on?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. She didn't wait for an invitation. She hurried inside, clutching the box like a lifeline, and locked the door behind her. "I need your help," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's happening. I found this." She placed the box on the small table in the center of the room and opened it, revealing the papers and the map. Her hands moved quickly as she laid them out, her words spilling over each other. There was a glow. The grave. It wasn't normal. "I found this buried there, and then something followed me. It was in the house. I barely got out." Hargrove's face darkened as he leaned over the table, examining the contents. His hand hovered over the map, his eyes narrowing as he traced the symbols with his fingers. "These marking? I've seen them before," he muttered almost to himself. "What do they mean?" Arya asked, her voice tinged with desperation. She needed answers, something to ground her in the chaos that had overtaken her life. Hargrove sighed, his shoulders slumping. "These symbols are ancient. They were used by a secret society, people who believed in protecting knowledge at any cost. The graves marked here aren't ordinary. They belong to individuals who held dangerous truths that others wanted to keep buried." Arya's stomach tightened. And my father's grave? Why was it glowing? What's so special about it? The historian hesitated, his gaze flicking toward her. The glow you saw. It's a phenomenon tied to those who died unjustly, whose truths were never revealed. It's said their spirits can manifest when someone stumbles upon their secrets. Your father must have uncovered something before he died. Something powerful enough to put his life in danger. Arya stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. But why my name? She asked, pointing to the map. Why is my name written there, with the date of my father's death? Hargrove frowned, leaning closer to examine the map, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he adjusted his glasses. This shouldn't be here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The date. Your name. It means... He trailed off, shaking his head as though trying to dismiss the thought. It means what? Arya demanded, her frustration spilling over. It means your father knew something would happen to you. Or worse, he thought you were already connected to this somehow? That your life was tied to the same secret that cost him his. Before Arya could respond, a loud crash shattered the silence. The sound came from the window near the front of the house, glass splintering as something heavy hit the floor. Both of them froze, their eyes locked on the darkened corner of the room where shadows shifted unnaturally. They've found us, Hargrove whispered, his face pale. We need to leave. Now. Who? Who's after us? Arya whispered, her voice cracking. The same people who buried these secrets, and they won't stop until the truth stays buried, or until we're gone. Without another word, he grabbed the map and the papers, stuffing them back into the box. Arya followed his lead, her pulse racing as she scanned the room for any sign of movement. The shadows in the corner seemed to writhe, a dark pulsing mass that defied logic. And then, as they turned toward the back door, a voice emerged from the darkness. You should have left it, it said, low and guttural, the same voice she had heard in the cemetery. Arya's breath caught, her knees weak as the coldness in the air intensified. Hargrove grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Don't look back, he hissed. Just run. And once again, Arya found herself fleeing into the night, her grip tight on the box that had upended her world. The cold air sliced through Arya's lungs as she and Hargrove ran into the darkened woods behind his house. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks catching at their feet as they pushed forward. The night seemed unnaturally still, as though the world itself had paused to watch. Behind them, faint whispers rose, carried by the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound burrowed into her mind, growing louder the more she tried to block it out. Hargrove led the way, clutching a small lantern that barely illuminated the path ahead. His voice was tight, urgent. We can't go back to the village. They'll expect us to. We need to get to the old church. It's the only place they won't follow. Arya's heart hammered in her chest. Why? What's so special about the church? He didn't answer right away, his focus on navigating the dense forest. Finally he said, It's sanctified ground. They can't cross it. Whatever they are. They're bound to the graves, to the secrets they were meant to protect. It didn't make sense, but nothing about the night did. Arya clutched the box tighter against her chest, her mind racing with questions. Who were these people, or things that hunted them? What was in this box that was worth so much fear and death? And why did her father's name keep appearing at the center of it all? A branch snapped behind them, loud and deliberate. Arya whipped her head around, her breath catching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single low hum that sent chills down her spine. They're coming, she gasped, her voice barely audible. Don't stop, Hargrove barked, his pace quickening. We're close. The church emerged from the darkness like a ghost, its weathered stone walls covered in creeping ivy. It stood at the edge of a clearing, its steeple leaning slightly, as though it had grown weary over the years. Hargrove shoved the heavy wooden door open and pulled Arya inside, slamming it shut behind them. For a moment, silence enveloped them. The air inside the church was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and wax. Arya sank to the floor, her legs trembling as Hargrove lit a few candles scattered along the altar. Their flickering light cast long shadows that danced across the walls. But for the first time, the darkness felt less oppressive. "They won't come in here," Hargrove said, his voice steadying. "At least not directly. We have some time." Arya leaned against the wall, her breath still coming in shallow gasps. "What are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did we see back there?" Hargrove hesitated, his face grave. "I don't know what they truly are. Spirits, curses, manifestations of the ones who hid these secrets. I've heard all kinds of theories over the years. But one thing is certain. They exist to protect what should remain buried, and now, because of this—" He gestured to the box. "They'll stop at nothing to silence us." Arya's throat tightened. She looked down at the box, her fingers tracing the rough edges. "Then why did my father leave this for me to find? If it was so dangerous, why didn't he destroy it?" Hargrove sat down beside her, his eyes fixed on the map he had unfolded again. "Your father was a stubborn man, but he believed in the truth above all else. Whatever he found, he knew it was worth the risk. He must have trusted that you'd understand that too." The weight of his words settled heavily on her chest. She glanced at the map again, her gaze drawn to the symbols and her own name circled in the corner. "And this?" she asked, pointing at the ominous marking. "Why is my name here? What does it mean?" Hargrove's jaw tightened. "It means you're part of this story, whether you like it or not. Whatever your father uncovered, it wasn't just about him. It was about you. And that's why they won't stop. They think you're the key to it all." Before Arya could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the church, loud and deliberate. Her breath caught, and she looked at Hargrove, her eyes wide with fear. The knocks came again, slow and rhythmic, each one reverberating through the small space. "They can't come in," Hargrove said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "They're trying to scare us." The knocks stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. And then a voice broke through, low and guttural, the same one she had heard in the cemetery and the house. "Arya," it said, dragging out her name with a twisted familiarity. "You can't run forever." She gripped the box tighter, her knuckles turning white. "How do they know my name?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Hargrove stood, his face pale but determined. "They've always known. Your father's connection to this. It didn't start with him. It started long before you were born." Arya's mind reeled, the questions multiplying with every word he spoke. But before she could ask, the voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the stone walls. "Give us the box, and you'll be spared." The candles flickered violently, the air growing colder by the second. Hargrove moved to the altar, grabbing a large book bound in leather. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice steady, "you don't give it to them. They're lying." Arya nodded, though her hands trembled as she held the box. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but something inside her told her to keep going. Whatever was in this box, it wasn't just dangerous. It was the truth. And the truth, no matter how terrifying, had to be revealed. The pounding on the church door grew louder, each strike echoing through the stone walls like a war drum. Arya pressed herself against the cold floor, clutching the box to her chest. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the door. The voice outside came again, sharper, almost desperate. "Arya, don't let him fool you. He doesn't want to protect you. He wants the truth for himself." Her stomach churned at the words. They sounded clear and calm, too human to be the monstrous force that had chased her. She glanced at Hargrove, who was thumbing through the heavy book he'd pulled from the altar. His face was set, determined, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt or fear that made her stomach twist. "Hargrove," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are they talking about? Why are they saying you're lying to me?" He didn't look up, his fingers frantically flipping through brittle pages. "Don't listen to them. They're trying to manipulate you. That's what they do. They twist the truth." But his words didn't settle her. Instead, they stoked the growing unease inside her. She tightened her grip on the box, her mind spinning. The voice had said something earlier, something that hadn't left her since she first heard it. Trust no one. Another strike against the door made her flinch, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Her heart jumped into her throat. "They're breaking in!" she hissed, panic flooding her chest. Hargrove slammed the book shut, his jaw tight. They can't come inside, not fully, but they can make it hard for us to leave. He walked toward her, his shadow looming in the flickering candlelight. We need to use what's in the box to figure this out. Now. Arya stared at him, her pulse quickening. You said they couldn't come in. Now you're saying we're trapped? Her voice rose, her fear bubbling over. What aren't you telling me? Hargrove's lips parted, but before he could respond, a sudden crash shattered the heavy silence. The windows at the back of the church exploded inward, shards of glass scattering across the floor. A frigid wind swept into the room, carrying with it a low, guttural sound that didn't belong in this world. Hargrove grabbed her arm, his grip firm. We don't have time for this. Open the box. Her instinct screamed against it. Something about the box felt like a Pandora's curse, a key that could unlock something far worse than what was already happening. She hesitated, her hands trembling. What if they're right? She asked, her voice barely audible. What if you're not telling me the whole truth? Hargrove's expression hardened. Arya, listen to me. If you don't open it now, none of us are going to survive the night. His words were cut off by a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadows in the room moved unnaturally, pooling together into a dark mass that slithered across the floor. Arya's breath hitched as the temperature plummeted. She felt it now, something ancient and angry pressing against the walls of the church. The voice came again, rising above the chaos. Arya, don't let him have it. He's not your ally. Her grip tightened on the box as her thoughts spiraled. Who was telling the truth? Who was lying? Her father's words echoed in her mind, scrawled on the brittle pages of the journal she'd found. Trust no one. Hargrove, she said, her voice steadying despite the fear coursing through her. What's really in this box? He didn't answer. His silence stretched, his eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, she saw something shift in his expression, something she hadn't noticed before. Desperation. Hargrove, she pressed, her tone sharper now. What's in it? Before he could respond, the shadows lunged. They surged forward like a living tide, forcing Arya and Hargrove to dive in opposite directions. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging the church into darkness. Arya scrambled backward, clutching the box tightly as the air around her grew heavier, suffocating. The shadows moved with purpose, drawn toward her like moths to a flame. Arya! Hargrove shouted from somewhere in the dark. Open it now! But she didn't. She couldn't. Her father's warning rang louder than Hargrove's voice, drowning out the chaos around her. Trust no one. Her hands shook as she felt along the surface of the box, her fingers brushing over the strange markings engraved into the wood. The symbols seemed to pulse beneath her touch, warm and alive. The voice returned low and clear, cutting through the noise. You hold the truth, Arya. But the truth isn't always your ally. Her breath caught, the words hitting her with a weight she couldn't explain. The truth. That's what her father had died for, what this entire nightmare was about. But as she sat there, the shadows closing in and Hargrove's shouts echoing in her ears, she realized something else. The truth wasn't just dangerous, it was a choice. And whatever choice she made next would change everything. Arya's fingers hovered over the latch of the box, her mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. Hargrove's shouts came again from the darkness, more urgent now, but she didn't move. The truth wasn't just inside the box. It was everywhere around her, pressing against her, clawing for her attention. The shadows shifted closer, their formless edges licking at her shoes like tendrils of smoke, and the cold air tightened its grip on her lungs. Arya! Hargrove's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding. If you don't open it, we're done. Her grip on the box tightened. What happens if I do? She yelled back, her voice trembling. Why do they want it? Why do you want it? The shadows paused, their movement stilling as though they were listening. The voice that had followed her all night came again, quiet but piercing. Because they all fear it. The truth will destroy them, just as it destroyed your father. Her heart clenched. Every word twisted the knot of confusion in her chest tighter. The shadows were lying. Hargrove was lying. Maybe even the box was lying. But her father's face, buried deep in her memories, flashed in her mind. His quiet strength, the way he always said the truth mattered above everything else. Arya! Hargrove's voice snapped her back. She turned toward his silhouette, faintly illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the broken windows. He was closer now, his hand outstretched. "You don't understand what's at stake. Give me the box. I can handle this." She took a step back, clutching the box tighter. "Why do you need it so badly? You're not telling me everything." He hesitated, his hand lowering slightly. "Because I've been protecting this secret for decades," he admitted, his voice low. "Your father trusted me. He gave his life for this. I've kept it safe until now, waiting for the right moment. That moment is here." Her voice cracked with anger. "Then why didn't he warn me? Why didn't anyone tell me what I was walking into?" Hargrove's expression shifted, regret flickering across his face. "Because he knew you'd have to find your own way to the truth. It had to be you, Arya. You're the key to all of this." The shadows stirred again, their edges creeping forward. The voice returned, louder and more insistent. "Don't listen to him. He's used you, just like your father used you. Open the box and you'll see for yourself." The words struck her like a blow. She looked back at Hargrove, her chest heaving. "Is that true? Did my father use me?" His silence spoke louder than any denial could have. Her knees felt weak and she stumbled back a step, the box almost slipping from her grasp. "They're twisting it," Hargrove said finally, his voice softer now. "Your father loved you more than anything. He just wanted to protect you." "By dragging me into this?" She shot back, her voice rising. "By leaving me to deal with something I don't even understand?" The shadows lunged again, this time faster, more forceful. She gasped as the dark tendrils wrapped around her ankles, cold and suffocating. Hargrove shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the shadows' movement. And then, without thinking, Arya made her choice. She dropped to her knees, yanked the box open and pulled out the papers. The symbols on the map glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the furious beat of her heart. The shadows recoiled, shrieking, as though the light from the papers burned them. Hargrove's face lit up with a mixture of relief and fear. "What did you do?" he asked, stepping closer. Arya's eyes scanned the page in her hands. Her breath hitched as she read the words etched in her father's handwriting. "The price of truth is sacrifice. To save one, another must fall." Her stomach twisted. The glowing map shifted in her hands, the markings rearranging themselves into something new, a path leading to a single name written in bold, stark letters. She stared at it, her blood turning cold. The name wasn't Elias Ward. It wasn't Hargrove. It was her own. The shadows surged forward again, their anger palpable. But Arya didn't flinch this time. She held the map out like a shield, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she yelled into the darkness. "Why me?" The voice came again, quiet and final. "Because the truth begins and ends with you. Choose wisely, Arya. There's no turning back." The shadows recoiled slightly at her defiance, their tendrils flickering in and out of form like a candle about to gutter. Arya's hands trembled as she held the glowing map before her, its light steady and pulsing as if alive. Hargrove moved closer. His eyes locked on the shifting symbols, but he didn't reach for it. Something in his posture had changed. He seemed wary now, hesitant. "You were never meant to see this," he said quietly, his voice heavy with something she couldn't quite place, guilt maybe, or regret. "Your father, he hoped it wouldn't come to this." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look at him. "Why is my name here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "What does it mean? Tell me the truth, Hargrove. No more riddles. No more lies." He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It means the burden of the truth was always going to fall to you. Your father knew what he uncovered would put a target on his back and on yours. That's why he tried to shield you, to keep you away from this for as long as he could." "But why me?" she pressed, her voice rising. "Why is my name here? Why not his?" Hargrove hesitated, then finally said, "Because the truth wasn't his to reveal. It's yours." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Arya's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She looked back at the map, its glowing symbols rearranging themselves once more. The lines shifted, forming a new shape, an intricate sigil surrounded by smaller marks she now recognized as graves. One grave in particular stood out, its symbol burning brighter than the rest. It wasn't her father's grave, it was hers. Her chest tightened as dread crept over her. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, more to herself than to Hargrove. "I'm alive. I'm standing right here." The voice from the shadows returned, soft and insidious. "For now." Her blood ran cold. The tendrils of darkness began to slither forward again, their movements slower, more deliberate, as if savoring her fear. Hargrove stepped in front of her, his arms spread wide. "Stay back," he shouted at the shadows, though his voice wavered. He turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes filled with urgency. "Arya, listen to me. Whatever happens, you have to trust yourself. Not me, not them. Just you." She barely heard him over the pounding of her heart. The map in her hands glowed brighter, the sigil at its center pulsating with an intensity that made her eyes water. The paper she had taken from the box fluttered to the floor, their edges curling as though burned by an unseen flame. One sentence caught her eye, written in bold, deliberate handwriting she knew was her father's. "The truth will demand everything." The air around her thickened and the shadows surged forward with a deafening roar. Hargrove pushed her back, his voice desperate. "Go, run!" But she didn't move. Something in her refused to leave, refused to turn her back on the glowing map, the papers, the box, or the grave her father had left behind. She tightened her grip on the map and stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "No," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "I'm done running." The shadows paused, their movement halting mid-surge as if her words had struck them. The voice came again, this time low and almost curious. "Then choose." Her breath caught. The light from the map flared so bright it burned her skin, but she didn't let go. She saw now what the choice was, clear, painful, and impossible. The truth wasn't just something she could uncover. It was something she had to sacrifice for, something that would demand more than she had ever thought possible. "Arya!" Hargrove shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Don't!" But she already knew what she had to do. The truth wasn't for her. It never had been. It was for everyone else. The villagers who whispered in fear, the people who had suffered in silence, and the lives ruined by secrets buried too deep. It was bigger than her father, bigger than all of them. She took a deep breath, her hands steady, and made her choice. The light from the map exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding brilliance. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling into nothingness. The force of the light knocked her to the ground, the map slipping from her hands as the sigil burned itself into the air above her. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Hargrove's face, frozen in an expression she couldn't quite read, relief or maybe sorrow. And then, silence.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.